They told you Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen, a woman who chose duty over love, who sacrificed marriage for England. But what if she didn't choose anything? What if the real reason she never married, never had children, was hidden in her own body? For 400 years, they've kept her tomb sealed, and these 3 medical clues explain exactly why. In 1603, something happened inside Richmond Palace that was so disturbing, so completely shocking, that the British establishment has been hiding it ever since. When Elizabeth I finally died after 44 years on the throne, her body was wrapped and sealed in a lead coffin within hours. Not days. Hours, while she was still warm, while rigor mortis hadn't even set in. The servants who witnessed what happened in that room were immediately scattered across England, sent to remote estates with money in their pockets and threats ringing in their ears. Speak of this, they were told, and you'll hang for treason. The doors were locked the moment she stopped breathing. Guards were posted with strict orders that nobody enters or leaves under any circumstances. Only the most trusted ladies were allowed to remain in the chamber, and even high-ranking nobles who would normally have access to such a momentous occasion were removed without explanation. The counselors who controlled the scene gave explicit, chilling orders to everyone present. Speak of nothing you see here. Nothing. Whatever was about to be revealed when they undressed the Queen's body was so dangerous, so potentially catastrophic to the English monarchy, that they were willing to threaten execution to keep it buried forever. And that secret has remained buried for over 400 years, protected by silence, threats, and a tomb that has never been opened. 3 of the doctors who attended Elizabeth in her final months were dead within a year of her passing, and the circumstances surrounding their deaths raise questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Dr. Brown was found dead in his home. The official cause listed as sudden fever, a vague diagnosis that could mean almost anything and was impossible to verify or investigate. Dr. Hume fell down a flight of stairs and broke his neck, a tragically convenient accident that eliminated another witness to whatever had happened in the Queen's chambers. Dr. Adslow suffered what the records describe as apoplexy, another catch-all term that explained nothing while closing all avenues of inquiry. All 3 men had been present during Elizabeth's final weeks of life. All 3 had access to her private chambers and would have observed things that ordinary courtiers never saw. All 3 died before they could write memoirs, before they could confide in colleagues, before they could pass on whatever knowledge they had gained about the Queen's true physical condition. The servants who had witnessed the preparation of her body were scattered to remote estates across the kingdom immediately after the funeral. They were given comfortable positions and generous pensions, but also dire warnings about what would happen if they ever spoke about what they had seen. One lady-in-waiting who had been present when they undressed the corpse was sent to a distant property in the far north of England. She never returned to court and lived out her remaining days in comfortable but isolated silence. Here's what makes this extraordinary level of secrecy so remarkable and so suspicious. The body they were so desperate to hide remains sealed in Westminster Abbey to this very day, untouched and unexamined for over 400 years. Every other English monarch of significance has been studied by historians and scientists. In 2012, researchers dug up Richard III from underneath a parking lot in Leicester, where his remains had been lost for 5 centuries. They CT scanned his skeleton, ran comprehensive DNA tests, and analyzed his bones in every way modern science allows. They determined what he ate, how he died, what diseases he suffered from, and even reconstructed his face using computer modeling. Henry VIII's tomb has been opened for examination. Catherine of Aragon's remains have been studied. Medieval kings have been exhumed. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs have been unwrapped and subjected to genetic analysis. But not Elizabeth I. Request after request has been denied. In 1952, historians petitioned to examine her remains during the coronation of Elizabeth II. Denied. In 1975, when new non-invasive scanning technology became available that could examine the contents of her coffin without even opening it, researchers asked for permission. Denied. In 2003, on the 400th anniversary of her death, multiple prestigious universities submitted formal petitions offering to fund all research and promising absolute discretion. Denied. The official explanation is always the same: respect for the dead. But why don't they show other dead monarchs the same level of protection? What makes Elizabeth so different? The answer to that question lies in what trained observers noticed while she was still alive. Ambassadors in Tudor England weren't just diplomats exchanging pleasantries at state dinners and negotiating trade agreements. They were highly trained spies whose primary job was to study foreign royals in exhaustive detail and send meticulous reports back to their home governments. Kings and princes needed this intelligence to evaluate potential marriage partners and political allies. So ambassadors spent years learning how to assess physical characteristics with precision, how to read body language for signs of deception or weakness, and how to spot indicators of illness or abnormality that might affect diplomatic calculations. These men had observed hundreds of royal women across every court in Europe throughout their careers. They knew exactly what queens were supposed to look like, how they were supposed to move, how they were supposed to speak, how they were supposed to carry themselves in both public ceremonies and private audiences. Their observations weren't casual impressions, but professional assessments honed by years of experience and training. So when multiple ambassadors from different countries working independently and with no coordination between them noted that something was distinctly unusual about Elizabeth I, their observations carried enormous weight. The Venetian ambassador wrote in his official dispatches that Elizabeth possessed a very loud voice and what he called a masculine manner of speaking. Another diplomat described her as having more the bearing of a soldier than a lady. These weren't political attacks designed to undermine her reputation. These were confused professional observations from trained experts who genuinely couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. The most disturbing and consequential report came from a Spanish envoy who was immediately recalled to Madrid after writing it. His diplomatic career effectively ended by a single sentence. In his dispatch to the Spanish court, sent through encrypted channels reserved for the most sensitive intelligence, he wrote 7 words that got him pulled out of England within days of its arrival. Her Majesty's form is not as other women's. That's all he said. He never got the opportunity to explain what he meant or elaborate on his observation, because he was removed from his position before he could send any clarification. His report was buried in Spanish archives, hidden among thousands of other diplomatic documents where it sat undiscovered for centuries, until modern historians found it during systematic reviews of the period. What exactly did this trained observer see that was so shocking it ended his career? What did he mean when he wrote that Elizabeth's form was not like other women's? The phrasing is deliberately vague, chosen carefully by a man who knew his dispatches might be intercepted, yet it's unmistakably significant. It suggests something visually apparent, something that didn't match what an experienced diplomat expected to see when observing a royal woman. Other ambassadors from the same era echoed similar confusion using different words. They described Elizabeth's hands as surprisingly large and powerful for a woman. They noted that she walked with what they called a soldier's stride, rather than the graceful glide expected of noble ladies. They commented on her physical strength, which seemed excessive for a woman of any era, let alone the delicate feminine ideal of Tudor culture. What makes these diplomatic reports so compelling as evidence is that every ambassador who wrote them had strong incentives to describe Elizabeth favorably rather than critically. Most of them were actively trying to arrange marriage alliances between their royal masters and the English queen. The Spanish wanted her to marry a Habsburg prince and bring England back into the Catholic fold. The French proposed multiple suitors over the course of her reign, hoping to gain influence over English foreign policy. Various German principalities sent representatives to assess her suitability as a bride for their Protestant princes. Swedish, Danish, and Austrian diplomats all came to England at various times, hoping to negotiate matches. Every single one of these ambassadors came to London expecting to meet a typical royal woman, and left writing reports that hinted at something unusual, something they couldn't quite explain, something that made Elizabeth fundamentally different from every other queen or princess they had ever observed in their careers. They weren't being malicious or trying to sabotage marriage negotiations. They were simply confused, struggling to describe what they saw to masters who would never meet Elizabeth in person and needed accurate information. And their collective confusion speaks louder than any individual report could. These men had spent their entire professional lives studying royalty, and none of them could make Elizabeth fit into any category they knew. She was female, obviously and undeniably, but something about her was profoundly different. Something that made seasoned diplomats from multiple countries struggle for adequate words. But ambassadors only observed Elizabeth from a careful distance, at formal ceremonies and diplomatic audiences, where elaborate costumes and careful staging controlled what they could see. The people who got close enough to witness what was really beneath the gowns and makeup had reactions that were far more extreme. In 1566, Elizabeth fell so seriously ill that everyone at court believed they were watching their queen die. The illness struck suddenly and with devastating force. She developed a high fever that raged for days and refused to respond to any treatment her physicians tried. Intense sweating soaked through her bedding and nightclothes repeatedly. Most alarmingly, she experienced pain so severe that she couldn't stand upright or walk without multiple attendants supporting her weight. For nearly a week, she lay in her private chambers while her counselors gathered in antechambers and corridors, speaking in hushed voices about what would happen if she died. The succession was not secured. Elizabeth had no children, no designated heir, no clear plan for who would rule after her. If she died without naming a successor, England could descend into civil war as various claimants fought for the throne. Catholics would rally behind one candidate, Protestants behind another, and foreign powers would intervene to support whichever faction served their interests. Elizabeth herself believed death was imminent. She was so convinced she would not survive the crisis that she made a decision that would have caused political catastrophe had she lived. She nearly named Robert Dudley as Lord Protector of England, giving him authority to rule until the succession could be determined. Her counselors were horrified but could not dissuade her. In this desperate situation, her physicians begged for permission to examine her properly, something they had never been allowed to do before. Under normal circumstances in Tudor England, a thorough medical examination of the Queen would have been absolutely unthinkable, a violation of royal dignity so severe that no physician would dare suggest it. Touching the monarch's body was essentially forbidden except in the most superficial ways. You didn't undress a queen. You didn't look beneath the layers of silk and velvet and carefully constructed royal image. Physicians typically diagnosed royal patients by observing symptoms from across the room, checking pulse and tongue if they were lucky enough to get that close, and asking questions about what the patient was experiencing. They made their recommendations based on incomplete information and hoped for the best. But Elizabeth's illness was so severe in 1566, and the political situation so desperate, that she finally granted her physicians permission to conduct a thorough examination. What happened in her private chambers during that examination has haunted historians ever since. Her personal physician, a man named Dr. Hewick, who had served her for years and was trusted above all others, spent nearly an hour alone with the Queen. When he finally emerged from her chambers, witnesses who were waiting anxiously in the outer rooms reported that his face had gone completely pale. He looked troubled, they said, as if he had seen something that shook him to his very core. His hands were trembling slightly, and he seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes directly. The other physicians immediately pressed Dr. Hewick for information about what he had discovered and what treatment he would recommend. The counselors who had been pacing nervously demanded to know the Queen's condition and her chances of survival. Everyone wanted answers. Dr. Hewick refused to provide them. Beyond the bare minimum necessary for Elizabeth's immediate medical treatment, he would not say a single word about what he had observed during his examination. He prescribed medicines and recommended rest. He insisted on certain dietary modifications and environmental changes to her chambers. But he would not explain his diagnosis. He would not describe what he had seen. He would not discuss any aspect of the examination with fellow physicians, royal counselors, or anyone else who pressed him for information. In the days and weeks that followed, as Elizabeth slowly recovered from her mysterious illness, Hewick became increasingly withdrawn from court life. He stopped attending the social functions that were expected of someone in his position. He avoided conversations with medical colleagues who wanted to discuss interesting cases. When other physicians attempted to consult with him about the Queen's ongoing health, he would change the subject abruptly or simply walk away without offering any explanation for his strange behavior. Whatever he had seen in that examination room had affected him so profoundly that he could not discuss it even with trusted professional colleagues. A year later, Dr. Hewick was dead. The official cause recorded in the death registers was sudden fever, a convenient diagnosis that explained nothing and prevented any further inquiry. His medical notes and personal papers were never found. If he had written anything about what he observed during that fateful examination, anything that might explain his shocked reaction and subsequent silence, it vanished with him into the grave. Modern medical historians have spent decades studying these scattered accounts of shocked doctors, silent servants, and confused ambassadors trying to assemble a coherent picture from fragments and coded references. In recent years, a compelling theory has emerged that would explain every strange observation, every extreme reaction, every desperate act of secrecy that surrounded Elizabeth I. The theory proposes that Elizabeth had a condition known medically as Androgen insensitivity syndrome, or AIS. To understand what this condition means and why it would have been so significant in Tudor England, you need to understand some fundamental aspects of human biological development. Under normal circumstances, a person who has XY chromosomes, the genetic combination typically associated with male development, will develop male physical characteristics during fetal growth and puberty because their body responds to testosterone. This hormone triggers the formation of male reproductive anatomy and male secondary sex characteristics like facial hair, deeper voice, and masculine body structure. But in individuals with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, something fundamentally different occurs. These individuals have XY chromosomes in their cells, but their bodies completely lack the ability to respond to testosterone. The hormone is produced normally and circulates through their bloodstream, but their cells don't have the receptors necessary to detect or use it. As a result, their bodies develop along entirely female lines instead of male lines. They appear completely female externally with typical female anatomy and female physical features. But internally, they lack the organs necessary for female reproduction. The physical characteristics commonly associated with androgen insensitivity syndrome match the documented observations about Elizabeth I with remarkable and disturbing precision. Individuals with complete AIS are typically significantly taller than average women because they benefit from some of the growth effects of XY chromosomes without the masculinizing effects of testosterone. Elizabeth was notably tall for her era, standing above many of the men at her court, a fact that multiple contemporary sources confirm. People with AIS often develop deeper voices than typical women, a characteristic that ambassadors from multiple countries independently noted about Elizabeth throughout her reign without understanding what might cause it. They tend to have more athletic or angular builds rather than the soft curves typically associated with female physical development, which would explain the repeated observations about Elizabeth's masculine bearing and soldier's stride that so confused diplomatic observers. They typically have very little body hair compared to other women, a detail that would have been nearly impossible for outside observers to notice, but matches the few intimate descriptions that have survived from her ladies-in-waiting. Most significantly, individuals with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome do not and cannot menstruate because they lack the internal reproductive organs necessary for a menstrual cycle. They have no uterus, no ovaries, no capacity for pregnancy or childbirth. Several historical sources from Elizabeth's court hint, always using vague and careful language, that Elizabeth did not experience monthly cycles like the other women around her. If Elizabeth had androgen insensitivity syndrome, this diagnosis would finally answer the question that has puzzled historians for over 4 centuries. Why didn't she marry? The pressure on her to choose a husband was relentless and came from every direction throughout her reign. She was the most eligible woman in all of Europe, pursued by kings, princes, archdukes, and dukes from every major power on the continent. Her own counselors begged her constantly to select a husband and produce an heir to secure the Tudor succession. William Cecil, her closest advisor, wrote memoranda pleading with her to marry before it was too late. Parliament formally petitioned her multiple times to choose a consort. The political stakes could not have been higher. England's stability, its religious settlement, its independence from foreign domination all seemed to depend entirely on Elizabeth producing a legitimate heir through marriage. Without a clear succession, the country faced the prospect of civil war and foreign invasion the moment she died. Elizabeth always had excuses ready when the pressure became too intense. The timing wasn't right yet. This particular candidate wasn't suitable for various diplomatic reasons. She needed more time to consider England's interests properly. She would make a decision soon, she promised. Always soon, never now. Historians have proposed numerous explanations over the centuries. Perhaps she was psychologically traumatized by watching her father cycle through 6 wives, 2 of them executed. Perhaps she enjoyed the political power that came with remaining single and available. Perhaps she was playing an elaborate diplomatic game, using the possibility of marriage as a perpetual bargaining chip. But what if the truth was simpler and far more tragic? What if Elizabeth physically could not marry because any husband would have discovered her secret on the wedding night? What if the celebrated Virgin Queen wasn't choosing virginity at all, but desperately hiding a biological condition that would have destroyed her reign the instant it became public knowledge? To understand why Elizabeth would have been so desperate to hide any physical abnormality, you need to understand what it meant to be a woman in Tudor England, and especially what it meant to be a queen. A woman's entire value in 16th century society was measured by her ability to bear children, particularly sons. This wasn't just social preference, but was considered biological and theological truth. Women existed, according to the dominant beliefs of the era, primarily to continue family bloodlines and produce male heirs who could inherit property, titles, and kingdoms. A woman who could not fulfill this fundamental purpose was considered defective at the deepest possible level, a failure of nature, possibly even a sign of divine displeasure. For a queen, the stakes were infinitely higher. A queen's most important duty, arguably her only truly essential duty, was to produce a male heir who would secure the succession and prevent the chaos of disputed claims to the throne. Elizabeth's own mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed partly because she failed to give Henry VIII the son he desperately wanted. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth herself, and that failure contributed to her death on the executioner's block. Catherine of Aragon before her had been discarded and humiliated, her marriage annulled, and her daughter Mary declared illegitimate because she couldn't produce a surviving male heir. Every woman at the Tudor court understood viscerally what happened to queens who couldn't bear children. If Elizabeth had any physical condition that made childbearing impossible, she could never allow anyone to discover it. The political consequences would have been immediate and catastrophic. Her enemies would have declared her unfit to rule, arguing that a woman who couldn't fulfill the most basic female function had no right to sit on the throne of England. Catholics who already disputed her legitimacy, claiming she was the bastard daughter of a false marriage between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, would have seized on any evidence of physical abnormality as proof that God had cursed her. They would have argued that her very body demonstrated divine rejection of her claim to the crown. Foreign powers like Spain, which had been waiting for any excuse to invade England and restore Catholicism, would have used such a revelation as justification for military action. Even her own nobles, the men who served on her council and commanded her armies, would have begun calculating whether they might be better served by a different monarch, someone who could provide the succession that Elizabeth could not. The Virgin Queen persona that Elizabeth cultivated throughout her reign might not have been the brilliant political strategy historians have assumed. It might have been desperate survival, the only possible way to explain why she would never marry without revealing a truth that would have destroyed her. Elizabeth's father had executed her mother for failing to produce a son. Her sister Mary had been mocked throughout Europe for her false pregnancies and inability to give her husband Philip of Spain an heir. Elizabeth had watched powerful women destroyed by their reproductive failures her entire life. She knew exactly what would happen to her if anyone discovered she was physically incapable of childbearing. So she constructed an elaborate alternative identity. She became the Virgin Queen, married to England itself rather than to any mortal man. She transformed her inability to marry into a virtue, a sacrifice she was making for her country. She used her perpetual availability as a diplomatic tool, dangling the possibility of marriage before foreign suitors for decades while never actually committing to any of them. It was an incredibly dangerous game that required constant vigilance and perfect performance. One mistake, one moment when someone saw too much or understood too clearly, and everything would collapse. She surrounded herself with ladies in waiting she could trust with her life. She limited her physician's access to her body. She created elaborate rituals around dressing and bathing that ensured her privacy was never compromised. And somehow, against all odds, she maintained the deception for 44 years of her reign. But she couldn't hide everything from everyone. There was one person who knew her secret, one man who had seen through all the careful performance. And understanding his role in her life reveals just how tragic Elizabeth's situation really was. Robert Dudley was the love of Elizabeth's life, and their connection was obvious to everyone who spent time at the English court. They had known each other since childhood, thrown together by circumstances that could hardly have been more dramatic or traumatic. Both of them had been imprisoned in the Tower of London during the reign of Mary I, both facing the very real possibility of execution for treason. Elizabeth was suspected of involvement in plots against her Catholic sister. Dudley's father had been executed for attempting to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary. They were young, they were terrified, they were surrounded by enemies who wanted them dead. In that crucible of fear and uncertainty, they formed a bond that would shape both their lives forever. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, one of her very first official acts was to bring Robert Dudley to court and appoint him Master of the Horse. This wasn't just a prestigious title, but a position that required him to be constantly at her side, managing her horses, accompanying her on rides, attending her at all public events. For the next 30 years, Dudley was the fixed star around which Elizabeth's emotional life revolved. They rode together every morning through the parks around whichever palace she was occupying. They danced together at every court celebration, often performing elaborate choreographed pieces that showed off their natural physical harmony. They argued passionately and reconciled tenderly. They laughed at private jokes that no one else understood. Foreign ambassadors wrote scandalized reports home about the way Elizabeth looked at her master of the horse, the way she touched his arm when they spoke, the way she leaned close to whisper things that made him smile. Rumors about the nature of their relationship flew constantly through every court in Europe. Were they lovers? Was she planning to marry him? The Spanish ambassador claimed in encrypted dispatches that Elizabeth visited Dudley's private chambers at night, staying for hours before returning to her own rooms. English courtiers gossiped endlessly about what they witnessed behind closed doors. Some believed they were already secretly married. Others thought Elizabeth was simply using Dudley for physical pleasure without intending to formalize the relationship. The speculation never stopped because the reality never became clear. Elizabeth had the power to marry Robert Dudley anytime she wanted. She was the Queen of England, answerable to no one in matters of her personal life. She could have made him king consort with a single proclamation. Her council would have protested vigorously. Parliament would have expressed grave concerns. Foreign powers would have complained that she was marrying beneath her station. None of it would have mattered. She had absolute authority over her own marriage, and she was deeply, obviously, passionately in love with Robert Dudley. Yet she never married him. Despite 3 decades of constant companionship, despite love that everyone could see, despite having the power to do whatever she wanted, Elizabeth never made Dudley her husband. The conventional historical explanation for why Elizabeth never married Dudley centers on his first wife, Amy Robsart, who died under deeply suspicious circumstances in September 1560. Amy was found at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place with a broken neck. She had been alone in the house, all the servants having been sent away to a local fair. Rumors exploded immediately that Dudley had arranged her murder to free himself for the Queen. If Elizabeth married him now, the gossip ran, it would look like she had been complicit in the killing. The scandal would be too great, the political damage too severe. This explanation has satisfied many historians, but it has serious problems. Amy Robsart's death was thoroughly investigated by a coroner's jury and officially ruled an accident. The scandal, while intense initially, faded substantially within a few years as other news captured public attention. Elizabeth could have married Dudley in 1565 or 1570 or 1575, with no one much caring about his first wife anymore. She had decades of opportunities after the scandal subsided and took none of them. Something else was preventing the marriage, something more permanent than temporary scandal, something that couldn't be overcome by simply waiting for a public memory to fade. Dudley himself wrote something late in his life that hints at what that something might have been. In a letter that was subsequently destroyed but whose contents were recorded by contemporaries who read it, Dudley referred to a secret that bound him and Elizabeth together throughout their lives. But this secret, he wrote with evident pain, was a source of sorrow rather than joy. By late 1602, everyone at court could see that the end was approaching for Elizabeth I. She was 69 years old, ancient by the standards of her era, and visibly failing in ways she could no longer conceal. The famous energy that had sustained her through 4 decades of rule was fading noticeably with each passing month. She moved more slowly, she tired more quickly. The sharp wit that had terrified courtiers and ambassadors alike seemed to come and go unpredictably. Most dramatically, she had stopped wearing the elaborate makeup that had been her mask for so long. For 45 years, Elizabeth had appeared in public with her face covered in white Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic paste made from white lead and vinegar that created the porcelain complexion Tudor fashion demanded. The makeup had hidden her aging, her scars, and whatever else lay beneath its toxic surface. Now she couldn't be bothered anymore. She told her horrified ladies that she was past caring what people saw when they looked at her. "Let them look," she reportedly said. What did it matter now? Foreign ambassadors sent carefully worded dispatches home advising their governments to prepare for a transition in English leadership. The Queen was dying. Everyone knew it. Everyone was positioning themselves for what would come next. As Elizabeth's body failed, her behavior became increasingly strange and disturbing to those around her. She stopped eating almost entirely because swallowing had become agonizing. She managed occasional sips of broth or wine, but could not tolerate solid food. Her abdomen began swelling grotesquely over the final weeks, expanding larger and larger until she appeared to be several months pregnant. The irony was devastating and seemed almost deliberately cruel. The Virgin Queen, who had spent her entire life refusing marriage and rejecting motherhood, who had made her supposed purity into a political identity, now appeared pregnant as she approached death. The swelling was almost certainly caused by fluid accumulation as her liver and kidneys shut down. unable to process waste properly. The fluid had nowhere to go and collected in her abdominal cavity. But the symbolism haunted everyone who witnessed it. Then came the strangest behavior of all, the detail that confused and terrified her attendants more than anything else. Elizabeth refused to go to bed. For nearly 2 weeks at the end, she absolutely refused to lie down in her bed, despite pleas from everyone around her. Her doctors begged her to rest properly. Her counselors implored her to preserve her strength. Her ladies tried every argument they could conceive. She refused them all. She sat in chairs. She propped herself against mountains of cushions piled on the floor. She let her ladies hold her upright when she couldn't manage on her own. But she would not lie in that bed. When her ladies asked her why she wouldn't lie down and rest, Elizabeth gave different answers at different times, none of them entirely coherent. "Once I lie in that bed," she said at one point, "I shall never rise again." Another time she told them the bed is a trap, that death waits there. On other occasions, she simply shook her head violently and refused to speak about it at all. Was her refusal psychological, a final desperate attempt to maintain some control over a situation that was entirely beyond her control? Accepting the bed meant accepting death, surrendering to the inevitable, and Elizabeth had spent her entire life refusing to surrender to anything or anyone. Or was her refusal medical? Perhaps lying flat put unbearable pressure on her damaged and failing organs. Perhaps the fluid accumulating in her abdomen made breathing impossible in a horizontal position. Perhaps there were other physical problems we don't know about that made lying down genuinely more painful than remaining upright. By the final days, Elizabeth barely spoke at all. When words did come, they were fragments and disconnected pieces that made no logical sense. Latin phrases from prayers she had memorized as a child, names of people who had been dead for decades, half-remembered conversations with ghosts only she could see. She talked to her father, Henry VIII, who had died more than 50 years earlier. She argued with figures from her past who weren't there. She screamed about men dressed in black coming through the walls to take her away. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor finally stopped breathing. The woman who had ruled England for 44 years simply stopped. The moment Elizabeth died, her counselors moved with extraordinary speed, as if they had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The doors to her chamber were locked immediately. Guards were posted outside with strict orders that absolutely no one was to enter or leave without explicit permission from the most senior counselors present. Only the most trusted ladies in waiting were allowed to remain in the room. Even high-ranking nobles who would normally have had access to such a significant historical moment were removed without explanation. The counselors gave explicit instructions to the remaining women about what was to happen next. "Prepare the body," they ordered, "but speak of nothing you see." Nothing. Then they began undressing the queen's corpse, layer by layer. First, the elaborate gown, heavy with jewels and intricate embroidery that had taken seamstresses months to complete. Then the multiple petticoats underneath, each layer revealing more of what Elizabeth had been hiding beneath her magnificent costumes. When they reached the white makeup that had been Elizabeth's mask for 4 decades, they tried to remove it gently, but it came away in sheets, literally peeling off in large chunks and taking the queen's skin with it. Where healthy skin should have been pink or pale, Elizabeth's face was black and red and oozing. Decades of lead-based cosmetics had eaten through her flesh, creating wounds that looked like acid burns. One of the ladies in waiting vomited at the sight and had to be escorted from the room. She was immediately sent away to a remote estate, with instructions never to speak of what she had witnessed. They removed Elizabeth's corset, which had been laced so tightly and for so many years that it was practically embedded in her body. When they cut it away, they discovered deep, permanent grooves running across her entire torso, where the boning had pressed into her flesh for decades. Her ribs were visibly misshapen. Some of them cracked and healed improperly from the constant pressure. But these horrors, as disturbing as they were, could be attributed to known practices of Tudor fashion and cosmetics. What they discovered when they removed the final layers of clothing was something else entirely, something that couldn't be explained by fashion or makeup. The accounts that survive are written in coded language, recorded years later by elderly women who were terrified of being accused of treason. They use euphemisms and vague phrases that have puzzled historians ever since. But they all agree on one essential point. Something was wrong with the queen's body. Something between her legs was not as it should be, either absent when it should have been present, or present when it should have been absent. Wrong in a way that would have made her reign impossible had anyone known. One account phrases it. Another hints that nobody was allowed to investigate or examine the anomaly further. They were simply ordered to wrap the body as quickly as possible and tell no one what they had observed. The body was wrapped in cerecloth, layer after layer of treated fabric, designed to preserve remains and contain odors. Then Elizabeth's corpse was placed in a coffin made of lead, the same toxic metal that had been slowly poisoning her for 45 years through her makeup. The coffin was sealed within hours of her death, while her body was still warm, before rigor mortis had fully set in. They closed it before anyone else could see what was inside, before any more questions could be asked, before any additional witnesses could observe what lay beneath the legend of the Virgin Queen. The servants who had seen the preparation were scattered across England within days, sent to distant estates with money and threats. The doctors who had attended her final weeks died within the year under suspicious circumstances, and the coffin was rushed into the vault beneath Westminster Abbey faster than was customary for such an important monarch. James VI of Scotland became James I of England. The Tudor era ended and the Stuart dynasty began. And the very first thing James did, one of his earliest acts as the new king, was to issue explicit orders that Elizabeth's remains were never to be disturbed, never to be examined, never to be moved from their resting place under any circumstances. He had every reason to want Elizabeth's memory diminished. She had kept his mother imprisoned for 19 years and then ordered her execution. Yet he protected her tomb as if it contained the most precious secret in the kingdom. Unless, of course, he knew what was inside. Unless someone had told him what was discovered when they undressed the queen. Unless he understood that preserving the legend of the Virgin Queen, however false that legend might be, was more important than any personal grievance against the woman who had killed his mother. For 400 years, the British establishment has maintained that protection. For 400 years, they have denied every request to examine Elizabeth's remains. And for 400 years, the secret of what really lay beneath the crown has remained buried in Westminster Abbey, waiting for someone brave enough to finally demand the truth. If you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as we found researching it, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. We're uncovering hidden historical secrets that your textbooks never told you, and some of them are even darker than this one. Hit that like button if you believe it's finally time for Westminster Abbey to open that tomb and let science answer the questions historians have been asking for 4 centuries. And drop a comment below telling us what you think. Was Elizabeth I hiding a biological secret that would have destroyed her reign? Is that why they've kept her tomb sealed for 400 years? Or is there another explanation we haven't considered? Your theories might be featured in our next video. Remember, 400 years is long enough to keep secrets. The truth deserves to see daylight.